Hello. Welcome to this class of Persuasive Faith. I'm Rick Harvey, the teacher here in our local church. In this series of lessons, we are exploring the credibility of the Christian faith. If you find this lesson helpful, don't forget to hit the like button, and if you want to make sure you see future lessons, be sure to subscribe. If you would like a copy of the slide notes from this class, there's a link in the description below. Now, today's class. So, last week and today we are talking about epistemology, and epistemology is what?
How do you know?
Okay, the study of knowing or understanding about the whole idea of knowledge. And so last week we defined knowledge. Remember how we defined it? Three simple words. Justified, true belief, remember? And so we talked a little bit about what belief is. Belief is just simply something that you hold in your mind or in your thoughts as being true. And then we talked quite a bit about justification, the need for justification. In order to claim knowledge, I need to have some justification for the beliefs that I hold. We talked about how justification can come in various levels. So you can have various degrees of justification, and as our justification for a belief increases, we eventually get to a point, not that there's a definitive line, but we eventually get to a point where we can say, I know something is true. We stop saying simply, I believe, and we begin to say, well, I know this is true. And that happens as our justification increases. We also talked about the question of certainty, and we saw that what's called full certainty or absolute certainty is probably in most areas is just simply not achievable, because there's always some kind of logical, even if it may be far-fetched, it can still be a logical argument against a belief. And so at some degree, at some point, we say, I know, even though we may not have what is called full or absolute certainty. Okay? So today, I want to explore some more in this area of justification. Then I want to go on and talk about the question of truth. So before we do, though, I want to just kind of remind ourselves. Last week I very briefly talked about the definition of the word proposition, and it's a word that'll come up several times today, and over the course of the year it'll come up from time to time. And so I want to be clear what I mean when I'm using the word proposition. Okay. So again, this is something we talked about last week. When philosophers or epistemologists use the word proposition, what they are referring to is the content of a declarative statement. So, for example, if I use the statement, if I make the statement, the shirt is brown, okay, then I didn't plan that. That just happened that way. If I make the statement, the shirt is brown, okay, when I talk about the proposition in that, I'm not talking about the words that I'm using, the shirt is brown, nor am I talking about my act of saying it, the fact that I am saying it, but I'm talking about the content, the idea or the concept in my mind when I say it. Okay? So what that means, as I mentioned last week, is that you can use different words to express the same proposition. So it could, you could use different English words. You might use a different word for brown. My wife and I use different words for the same color all the time, and it causes all kinds of confusion in our relationship, right? Because what's just blue to me is navy blue to her, So anyway, you can use different words to express the same content or the same idea or the same proposition, all right? Or you may not express it at all. You may just simply have it as a thought in your mind. But in epistemology and philosophy, that's still a proposition, even if I'm not expressing it. It's that thought or that concept. It's the content behind the words or the content behind the expression. So I just want that to be clear in your mind. So when I throw that word out from time to time, you understand I'm not talking about the words, I'm not talking about the act, I'm talking about the content of what we're talking about. Okay? So again, last week we defined knowledge as justified true belief. Okay? And last week we defined belief, we talked about what belief was, and then we started exploring justification. And we talked about the need for justification and the degrees of justice and that sort of thing that we just mentioned. So what I want to do today is I want to explore more this idea of justification and ask the question, how do we justify? What's necessary to constitute justification of a belief? And then we'll go on and we'll talk about the idea of truth. So again, we talked about this last week, the term that we use to refer to justifying beliefs or justifying knowledge is the term epistemic justification. So the question is, how are beliefs justified? How do we accomplish epistemic justification? And there are two primary ways that people think of beliefs or knowledge being justified. And the first is foundationalism, and the second is coherentism. All right? And you might ask, and this happens a lot in some of these areas that we're going to be exploring this year, sometimes you go, well, why do I need to know this? You know, if in Christian apologetics, why do I need to know all this epistemology? And why do I need to know the categories of epistemic justification? Well, it's so you can throw the terms out and impress people, right? No, that's not why. But one of the things is it's helpful to be familiar with these categories because it can help us to understand how people reason, how do they get to their conclusion that they have truth or that they know something, okay? And so if somebody's, even you, when you're saying, well, I know this or I really believe this or I have strong justification, what is your justification? How does that justification work to convince you that you know truth? It's just helpful to understand how that process works in your own mind, but it's also helpful to understand how it's working in somebody else's mind. So when you're speaking with somebody else and they're thinking in one of these two categories, foundationalism or coherentism, if you understand those categories and you understand how they work, even if they don't know those categories, they may have just kind of picked it up by osmosis or whatever, you know, and so they're reasoning in a certain way, and if you understand how that reasoning works, you can identify that. Not that you need to tell them, well, you're a coherentist, or it's not that they need to know that, but what it does is it helps you see how they're reasoning, and if you know that there's a problem with one of these categories and that it's faulty, and you see they're operating in that category, then you can help them work through to reason better and to find truth. Okay, so that's why we want to take some time in early on here in apologetics to kind of get a handle on these things. So first of all, I want to talk about foundationalism. Again, we're talking about how we justify our beliefs so that we can claim knowledge. Okay? And foundationalism has historically been the way people justified beliefs. So from the days of the Greeks all the way through Western thought, foundationalism has been the primary way that beliefs were justified, that knowledge was justified. Okay? And the idea is quite simply that all knowledge rests on certain foundations. So, the name is pretty descriptive. Now, there is a thing called strong foundationalism, and there's something called weak foundationalism. And strong foundationalism is very difficult to maintain, and you'll see why here in a few minutes as we explore this a little bit deeper. But it's a little difficult to be a very strong foundationalist. But weak foundationalism really seems to best fit our experience. So when I'm reasoning, when I'm thinking, and if I stop and think about how did I get to this conclusion, weak foundationalism seems to best describe what's going on, okay? And one of the things about weak foundationalism is it allows some interplay with this other way of looking at things, coherentism, okay? So it allows for a little bit of coherence in this idea of foundationalism. And all this will make sense to you, I hope, as we go forward, as I explain it a little bit more, all right? So it helps me when thinking about foundationalism to be graphic. You know, I'm kind of a visual learner, and so it helps me to think graphically. So when I print the notes, my diagrams don't always print. So if you want the diagram, you have to draw it yourself in your notes. But if you think about foundationalism in this way, as I do, it's certainly been helpful to me. So let's say you have a belief. That belief is whatever it is, we'll just call it belief D. And this is going to be a very oversimplified diagram, but so that belief D is based on another belief that precedes it, that comes before it, okay? And that would be, here I call it belief C. Now I say it's oversimplified because actually belief D could be based upon several different beliefs, right? It could be belief C and belief R and belief F and whatever. So there could be several here in this level. But the point is, it is based upon another belief that precedes it. And that belief is also predicated on a belief or beliefs that precede them or upon which it is based. And that one, and similarly on down the line. So in my diagram here, D is based on C, is based on B, is based on A, okay? But we still don't have a foundation, okay? We just have all these beliefs, one belief built upon another, right? So what foundationalism teaches is that there is a foundation to all of these beliefs. And those foundations, or that foundation, is what is called a basic belief or basic beliefs. All right? So thinking about the diagram in that way, there are in foundationalism, there are two kinds of beliefs. There are what we call basic beliefs. So those are the beliefs in that bottom level down there in the diagram, okay? What we call the foundation. Those are basic beliefs, and oftentimes, particularly philosophers refer to them as a priori beliefs, okay? A priori, what does that phrase, a priori, what does that indicate to you? Priority, okay? It's the prior. It comes before everything else, all right? Sometimes they're also referred to as axioms. That's a little more ambiguous term, but sometimes they refer to them as axioms. And the characteristic of basic beliefs are they are immediate. In other words, they just come to us in some kind of immediate sense. They come directly to us. They don't come to us through something else, all right? And the other kind of belief, then, are non-basic beliefs. So in your diagram, D, C, B, and A are non-basic beliefs, and then you have the foundation belief or the basic beliefs. So non-basic beliefs are a posteriori, coming from what? Posterior, the end, or behind, right? So you have basic beliefs that have priority, come first, and then you have non-basic beliefs that come after, all right? And we say they are mediated. In other words, these beliefs come to us through other beliefs. So in our diagram, all those four beliefs in the triangle, those beliefs all came to us, mediated to us from the basic beliefs. All right? So you have these, in foundationalism, you have this very distinct concept of two different kinds of beliefs. Foundational beliefs, basic foundational beliefs, and then And then all the other beliefs, which are non-basic beliefs, they're not foundational beliefs, they're built upon other beliefs. All right? So then the question is, well, what makes a foundational belief a foundational belief? So what we're asking is, what is a properly basic belief? So I can't just kind of by fiat say, okay, this is a basic belief to me, okay? And I don't have to justify this belief because it's a basic belief. There has to be some criteria by which I know what beliefs are foundational beliefs. And that's the question we're trying to ask here. So the first thing is, obviously, it has to really be basic. So what I mean by that is it's not believed on the basis of other beliefs. So we have certain beliefs, you do, everybody does, even though they don't recognize it, they may not know it, they may even deny it, but everybody has certain beliefs that are not based upon any other beliefs. Okay? And those are basic beliefs. So they're not believed on the basis of external evidence. They're not believed on the basis of other propositions that you may hold to. They are just simply there as a basic belief. You know, you're probably at this point you're going, well, what are they? Well, we'll get to those in just a minute, what some of them are. But they are what we say self-presenting. That when this thought occurs in your mind, it just presents itself to you as true. All right? Or we might say it's self-evident. All right? So these truths, these basic beliefs are self-evident. When you think about that term self-evident, is there anything that comes to your mind? What? Declaration of Independence, right? Declaration of Independence. So the signers of the Declaration of Independence are saying what? We hold these truths to be self-evident that what? That we are all endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. Okay? So if you read through the Declaration of Independence, the signers of the Declaration, Thomas Jefferson, of course, the author, in the authoring of the Declaration of Independence, he makes all kinds of arguments, right? And he gives all kinds of reasons for why we think this and why we're going to do this and all that sort of thing, all right? But the one thing he does not argue for is the inalienable rights. He says those are self-evident, all right? And what he's saying there, and you may agree or not agree with him as to whether or not they are actually properly basic beliefs, but what he's saying there is he's saying that these inalienable rights that are given to all people by the Creator are self-evident. I don't have to argue for them. Everybody knows it's true. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Okay? So he says that those three things are so basic that we just all know it's right. And we don't have to argue for them. And from that basis, then, the rest of the Declaration of Independence is built, right? So that's just an illustration of this idea of self-evident truths that we don't argue for, we just accept them as true because they are self-evidently true. So David Gooding and John Lennox, in their book, Being Truly Human, say this. They say, we all must start somewhere with things we take as self-evident. Basic assumptions that are not proved on the basis of something else, they are often called axioms. So they're using that word axiom. I shy away from that word because it's sometimes used in other ways. I prefer that word a priori, or that phrase a priori. But the idea they're getting at here is everybody thinks this way. Every rational human being has to start somewhere with certain basic fundamental things, fundamental realities that are just self-evidently true. And everything else is built upon that. This is what is called foundationalism. So it has to be, as I said, if it's going to be properly basic, it has to be actually basic. It can't just be something that I've actually argued to on other bases and then I just claim that it's basic. It has to be properly basic. And then also, it has to be properly basic. It must have some ground. Okay, so although it's not based upon other propositions, it's not based upon other evidence, it does have to have some kind of ground to it, some quality to it that makes it basic. And that ground is that internal, immediate sense, or as the definition says here, the unavoidable the unavoidable inclination to believe it. So there are certain things which we have the unavoidable inclination to believe. So, just for sake of just illustration, go back to the Declaration of Independence. What they're saying is this idea of human freedom, that every individual is given freedom. If that is a truly basic belief, we would say that it's something that is internal, it's an immediate sense, that everybody has that sense that they ought to be free, right? That God has given them certain liberties and certain freedom. And they have an unavoidable inclination. Now, it doesn't say that they have to believe it, it just says they have an inclination to believe it. So in other words, it could be doubted, it could be questioned, and people might question it, but there is in every person this basic inclination to believe it. And that then would be the ground on which a belief is considered to be basic. Do we have that kind of innate sense that this is true? And there are kind of two views about how these work. And one view is the view of what's called strong foundationalism, which I mentioned a minute ago, okay? And in strong foundationalism, the idea is that these beliefs are incorrigible. They can't be challenged. They can't be questioned. They are infallible beliefs, all right? So this is why I suggested to you that strong foundationalism is very difficult to maintain, because as we look at a list of examples of some of these basic beliefs, you're going to see that there are people who do question, there are people who do challenge them in various areas, all right? So it seems very difficult to insist that they are so impressed upon our mind that we can't question them. And that's why I would not be a strong foundationalism. But in weak foundationalism, we just simply say they are prima facie justified. In other words, just looking on the face of it, they appear to be true, and I can't imagine any sufficient defeater. Remember we talked about defeaters last week? I can't imagine anything that would defeat the belief. So if I have, for example, an innate sense of the reasonableness of the laws of logic, which is something we'll talk about in a coming lesson. If I have a reasonable sense of, or I have a sense of just the reasonable of that, they're prima facie justified. I can't imagine any sufficient defeater that would defeat the laws of logic. All right? So that's what we call weak foundationalism, is foundationalism that just accepts those primary beliefs, those basic beliefs, those a priori beliefs, accepts them as being prima facie justified. They just seem reasonable to me, and I have no reason to question or doubt their truthfulness or their validity. So what then would be some examples? Well, foundationalists don't all agree, of course, on every point in this, but on the first two, there's pretty wide agreement, and that is sensory experiences or sensory beliefs. So I have certain beliefs that I have that come through my senses. So I'm seeing a tree, and I have the sense that I am seeing a tree. Now, obviously, people can have illusions, but if I don't have any real sufficient reason to believe that I'm having some kind of a delusion or whatever, if I'm seeing a tree, that is an immediate sense that I'm having, And the sense that I have, the sense that I'm having, that I'm seeing a tree, is not based upon some other belief. It's just something that presents itself immediately to me. It is not mediated to me through some other belief. I don't have to reason to the thought that I'm seeing a tree. I just see a tree and I'm having that experience, and that's just foundational. It's just basic, all right? So sensory beliefs, and then logic and reason. So most foundationalists agree on these first 2 points, sensory beliefs and logic and reason. So in a future lesson here coming up here in a couple, 3 weeks or so, we're going to be in talk about argument and reasoning and logic, okay? And one of the things we're going to talk about are the foundational laws of logic. And one of the foundational laws of logic is the law of non-contradiction. And the law of non-contradiction simply says that a proposition cannot be true and false at the same time in the same way. Okay, it can't contradict itself, all right? And that just seems manifestly true, all right? That just presents itself to me as completely true and reasonable. So the proposition that I am here in this room cannot be true and not true at the same time in the same way. Now certainly I can be here physically and mentally be off somewhere else, okay, but that's a different way. Or I can be here now and be in the sanctuary later, okay? So in a different time, it could be true and false. But right now, I am here physically, and if I say I'm here physically in this room, that can only be true or false. It can't be both, okay? That's the law of non-contradiction. Now, that just seems conspicuously true to us, right? Okay. It's amazing, though, how many times when you're talking with people, when you're reasoning with people, you're going to find them violating the law of non-contradiction, and they're holding contradictory concepts at the same time in their mind. So people do that, but when you point it out to them, they immediately go, oh, okay, there's something wrong here, because I know as a foundational, basic, a priori belief, the law of logic says, even though they don't even know what the laws of logic are, they have the belief in the law of non-contradiction, okay? As I mentioned, foundationalists generally agree on those 2 points. On the following points, there's more disagreement, more discussion. Okay, so this one's a little ambiguous, and let me just mention something. I meant to mention this as we were getting started. This whole area of epistemology is pretty abstract, right? It's kind of way out there, and some of this is hard to grasp. I just want to encourage you that the stuff we're talking about today and last week and today particularly is some of the hardest stuff we're going to talk about all year. So it's not all going to be like this, all right? So I just want to encourage you on that. But self-presenting properties. So if I have an apple here and it's a red apple and I'm looking at this apple, okay, that apple, this particular apple, has the property of being red. That's one of its properties. It's round, it's sweet, it's a fruit. There's a lot of things, a lot of properties. But one of its properties is red, all right? And I have the sense that I'm being appeared to redly, okay? I'm perceiving this property in this apple, okay? That would be a foundational belief. That would be a properly basic belief, at least in the minds of many foundationalists. Basic mathematics. You know, you really don't have to argue with a child when you're trying to teach them that 2 + 2 is 4. You just show them, and they go, oh yeah, okay, I got it. You know, and they just get it, right? They just get it because it's basic. Some other math is another story altogether. All right. Moral beliefs. Okay, the area of conscience, all right? So the idea that mercy is good. That's just a basic belief. And when you talk to people, integrity, honesty is good. Now, clearly people deny that. And I was thinking of Anne Rand when it comes to her challenge to the idea of the moral goodness of love, you know. So there are people who challenge these moral beliefs, but in general, when you talk to people, prima facie, they're true. They just go, well, yeah, love is good, mercy is good, okay? These are just primary a priori beliefs that we have. And then there are theological beliefs that fit into this category. The idea that God exists, the idea of eternity, that I'm going to live on beyond death, okay? So Ecclesiastes says that God has placed eternity in their hearts. So the idea of this sense of as I'm going to have some kind of enduring existence. It's all over the world. People all over the world have a sense of eternity, right? Now, clearly there are many people who deny that, who say, well, I don't believe that. But as Romans says, what they're doing is they're suppressing an innate sense that they have, that God has placed there in them, of eternity. John Calvin talks about the sensus divinitatis, okay? And the sensus divinitatis is what John Calvin says is in every person there is a sense of the divine. Every person has a sense of the divine. So even little children, you know, when you talk to them about God, they're going, oh yeah, that makes sense. You know, that works with what I think, okay? Now clearly there are millions of people in the world who deny that, okay? But what John Calvin says is they start with this sensus divinitatis, and then they have to deny that. They have to change their mind in order to end up where they end up. So these are just some examples. Like I said, the first two are pretty universally accepted among foundationalists. The others there's debate about, but they very likely do fit within this category. At least most of them. So those would be some examples of what we're talking about, of foundational beliefs upon which all other beliefs rest. So it's actually from those foundations then that we build up the rest of our beliefs and justify the rest of our beliefs so that we ultimately can claim, I know such and such, I know this is true, or I know that is true. Okay? The second category then is coherentism. And the essence of coherentism basically is that this idea of two kinds of beliefs that we talked about in foundationalism. In coherentism, there is no such thing. There are not two kinds of beliefs. There are not basic beliefs and then a posteriori beliefs. Coherentism eliminates that. Okay, so in coherentism, then, all beliefs are on a par. All beliefs are equal. And beliefs are justified then not on the basis of whether or not where they fit in this hierarchy of foundation and then building up, but they are based on the relationship between the beliefs. All right? And as with foundationalists, you had strong foundationalists and weak foundationalists. With coherentists, you have linear coherentists. And with linear coherentists, you have a set of beliefs. So here, again, we got A, B, C, and D. We've got this set of beliefs. And in coherentism, in linear coherentism, the belief B is justified by belief A if it coheres with belief A, if it works with belief A, okay? Now you may wonder, what do you mean by cohere? Well, that's part of the problem, as we'll see in a minute. But I like to use the term, it plays well. Okay, so if B plays well with A, then it's justified. And similar then C with B and D with C, okay? But then here comes the problem. D is justified if it coheres well with A. What's the problem here? Pardon? It's circular reasoning, isn't it? Okay? So ultimately, A is justified by A. Right? And B is justified by B. Right? So we run into this problem of circular reasoning, which, by the way, violates one of the laws of logic, which as a foundationalist I would say is an a priori belief, the idea that circular reasoning is faulty, right? So it starts out looking like it's linear, like foundationalism, B based on A and C based, but ultimately it comes around, all right, and becomes circular reasoning. A way that seeks to kind of avoid this problem, and incidentally, I see theologians do this too, by the way, but a way that seeks to avoid this problem is, again, you have a set of beliefs, but instead of this kind of real distinct linear justification, you have more of a holistic justification, okay? So B coheres well with C, coheres well with A coheres well with C, coheres well with D, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's this kind of web of coherence, all right? And if your beliefs cohere well together, then they are justified. Now I want you to notice that in coherentism, you're not really talking about a specific belief. You're talking about your whole belief structure. Does your whole belief structure work? And you're not calling into question any particular belief. It's do they all work together? Whereas in foundationalism, you can examine each individual belief and ask what is the basis upon which that belief is structured. We see this kind of thing all the time. We see it in politics, we see it in science, we see it all the time, all around us. Okay, is people construct a belief structure or a belief system that is totally coherent within itself. And so they believe it justifies their claim to knowledge. Right? This goes on in the area of climate science. It goes on in the area of evolution. It goes on in the area of the origin of life. It goes on in politics. It just goes on in all kinds of areas. It goes on in the whole recent thing with critical theory, critical race theory. We see the same kind of phenomena going on. Okay, so again, in coherentism, all beliefs are on a par with each other, and beliefs have to cohere with each other. But there's a problem then with this with what I'm describing here as what we call strong coherentism. Okay, and we've already pointed out that the primary problem is it basically amounts to circular justification or circular reasoning. All right, so ultimately a belief is being justified on the basis of its own self. The second problem is it leads to what's called isolation. And what we mean by this is the belief structure kind of gets cut away from truth. It gets cut away from reality. So it doesn't have to be really tethered to reality. It's a belief structure that just works in itself. And the person who's in this kind of a belief structure feels totally satisfied because everything that they believe works well with everything else they believe, right? And so they're completely satisfied, and you can't challenge them with reality. You can't challenge them with truth. A third problem with coherentism is that you can have competing, contradictory belief systems. So Brian could have one, right? And I could have another belief system, and his totally coheres within itself, and mine totally coheres within my own belief system, but they disagree. He's a Muslim and I'm a Christian, say, or he's an atheist and I'm a theist, all right? And he's got his all figured out, so everything works well together, and I've got mine all figured out and it works well together, but how do you adjudicate it, all right? So clearly this then lends itself to the kind of relativism that we see today, right? But I don't want to totally dismiss the idea of coherentism, because clearly, even as a foundationalist, I want my beliefs to cohere with one another, right? So I don't want to be holding two contradictory beliefs and claim they're based on foundations. So that's why we say that there is some interplay maybe between this idea of coherentism and foundationalism, but certainly not at the extremes of strong foundationalism or strong coherentism. So essentially then, the conclusion that I would reach from the things we've been talking about epistemic justification, is that my beliefs are justified, my claim to knowledge is justified, if in fact my beliefs rest upon some kind of sufficient foundation of other beliefs and ultimately on what are properly basic beliefs. So if I have a belief, belief D, and if it rests well upon other beliefs that are similarly justified beliefs, if it rests on them, and that rests upon this basis of certain self-evident, self-presenting realities that I just know, then I can say I have justification for this belief, and if I have sufficient justification, I can say I know this. That's how I can say, even though I can't claim absolute certainty, okay, I can claim a high degree of certainty that I know that God exists. I can claim with a high degree of certainty that I know that the Bible is true, that it is the infallible Word of God. I can claim with a high degree of certainty that Jesus Christ died for my sins and rose from the dead. And the reason I can do that is because I have beliefs that are founded upon other well-justified beliefs that are founded upon certain fundamental, basic, properly basic beliefs that justify that claim of knowledge. Okay? So where are we so far? So we're talking about justified true belief, what is knowledge, and we talked about what belief is, we talked about what justification is, both the necessity of it and what it is. So now let's think about truth. What is truth? And I just want to point out that, excuse me here, I just want to point out that the Bible, just like it assumes the possibility of knowledge that we talked about last week, the Bible also assumes that truth exists. The Bible is, it doesn't lay out a explicit theory of truth in so many words, but very clearly the Bible says that truth is both knowable and that it's objective. That truth somehow lies outside of the person. That doesn't mean, I'm not saying that I can't have the truth or believe the truth or the truth be in me, but when I say the truth is in me, I don't mean the source of truth is in me. I just mean that I know and believe the truth, right? But truth is, according to the Bible, something that's outside of me by which I am judged and measured, right? So there's a number of examples. I'm going to go through them very quickly. Genesis 42. Joseph is saying to his brothers, he says, I'm going to test you to see whether or not the truth is in you. What he's saying is, I'm going to test you to see if you're lying. So that's what he's saying. Are you guys lying? I'm going to put a test on you to see if you're lying. So in other words, there's truth out there. Are his brothers speaking it, or are they lying to him? That's the issue. In Exodus, God says, you shall not bear false witness. He prohibits us from distorting the truth. In Deuteronomy 18, there's a specific test given for testing the prophets to see whether or not they are speaking truth. So the truth is not in the prophets, it's external to the prophets, and are they representing the truth? In 1 Kings 8, in Solomon's prayer, he's saying to God, let your words be true or come true. So what he's saying is, you said certain things are going to happen. I want to see those things happen. I want to see the things you spoke actually become reality. In Isaiah, the Lord says, I speak the truth. I declare what is right. In Romans 1, of course, we saw that it's possible to suppress the truth. And then Paul talks in 2 Timothy, and of course there are many other examples, but Paul talks in 2 Timothy about repentance that leads to a knowledge of the truth. So the truth is out there and it's knowable as long as I go through the proper process that I need to go through to acquire that truth. So the truth is out there, it's knowable. So we get both this idea of objectivity, it's separate from the person, distinct from the person, and it is knowable. We can access at least some of the truth. And so this brings up then the question of how do we relate to the truth? What is the relationship between humans and the truth? And there are two views on that, of course, as there are on so many things, right? And the first view is what's called the absolutist truth. This is the view we're getting from Scripture. Is that truth is objective. It's outside of the person. In other words, it's true for all people at all times, right? So George Washington was President of the United States. That's true, and it's true for all people at all times. Now, he's not president now, right? That isn't true. But it is true that he was president. And for all people at all times, even those before he was president, it was true that George Washington was going to be president at that particular time in American history, right? And that truth is external to the person. I don't make it true. It's just true because that's the reality. That's what he was, all right? So that's the absolutist view. The relativist view, on the other hand, is that truth is subjective, that I get to decide what's truth. It's what I believe and what I think is truth, okay? So it depends on the person, and it differs then from person to person and time to time. And that's why we get the moral confusion that we get in America today and in the West today, because people think, well, yeah, that morality was good 150 years ago, but we're more enlightened now, so we know that, it's not. And so we can alter morality and we can alter truth, right? And so all this stuff in the last few months with kind of rewriting history, okay? This is, that's Western truth, or that's white man's truth, or whatever, okay? No, truth is truth. It's true for all people at all times, okay? So there are those two views. But on another plane, there are three distinct theories of truth, all right? And the first is what is called correspondence. And correspondence is the idea that a proposition is true. Remember what we said a proposition is. It's the content there, the idea or the thought. A proposition is true when it corresponds to reality, the way things really are. Very simple, okay? Seems to make sense, doesn't it? A proposition is true when it corresponds to the way things really are. And this was the universal definition or understanding of truth till the 19th century. So throughout Western thought, from the Greeks until today, or up until the 19th century, this was how truth was understood to be. This is what truth was. It was propositions that corresponded to the way things really were. The second way of looking at it is coherence. So this idea of coherence comes up again, all right? But this idea of coherence is distinct from epistemic justification, which is what we were talking about a little bit ago. So we're talking about epistemic justification, we're talking about foundationalism and coherentism, okay? Now we're talking about truth, and we're talking about correspondence and coherentism or coherence. So this is closely related to the coherentism that we talked about in epistemic justification, but it is a different thing, okay? It's not identical. So I just want to make that clear. So again, a proposition is true when it coheres well with a person's other beliefs. So as I said, this is related to, but distinct from, coherence as a means of epistemic justification. So what are the problems with this coherence view? Well, one of the problems, and the same problem we ran into in epistemic justification, is how do you define coherence? When does a truth cohere well with another truth? And what are the standards of measure? That's all very ambiguous. Nobody's been able to pin that down, okay? So there's a lack of definition there. The second problem is it derives from this coherentism in epistemic justification. That's where it derives from, okay? So what that means is it carries all the baggage of the coherentism that we found in epistemic justification. And, of course, again, as we talked about in epistemic justification, it's conducive to relativism. So if all that needs to happen for a proposition to be true is for it to cohere well with all my other propositions, then once again, Brian and I can have two different truths. He can have a truth where all of his truths cohere together, and I can have a truth where all my truths cohere together, and they be at odds with one another, or they be in conflict. All right? So what happens then is ultimately, because it's detached from reality, it leads to a denial of reality. So you begin to actually deny the way reality is. So correspondence is linked directly to reality. Correspondence says something is true if it corresponds to reality, but coherentism in defining truth has no connection to reality. So ultimately, it can lead to the denial of reality. A third view that you will sometimes encounter is pragmatism, and this sounds a lot like coherentism, but the idea is a proposition is true if it works. Okay, well, that can get really, really, really subjective, and the problem is that how do you define what works? And the problem with pragmatism is, in order to define what works, you have to go outside of pragmatism to define it. You have to have another view of truth in order to define what works, and then apply that to pragmatism. And so pragmatism ultimately breaks down. So in conclusion then, on truth, a proposition is true if it corresponds to the way things really are. That's truth, okay? So just to cut to the chase, that's what truth is. So just going back then over the last couple weeks, what we're talking about is knowledge and how do we know, right? And this is going to come up again over the course of the year as we talk about various things, and we ask, how do we know? What we're going to be doing is we're going to be applying these principles we've been learning in the last couple of weeks, all right? So what is knowledge? And just to summarize, knowledge is a belief, all right? And we talked about what a belief is. It's just a thought or an idea or a proposition that you hold, right? So knowledge is a belief for which we have sufficient justification. And in other words, applying foundationalism as our means of epistemic justification, something is justified if it's based on other sufficiently justified beliefs and rests upon certain foundational or basic beliefs. So knowledge is a belief that is justified by being based upon other justified beliefs and ultimately upon a foundation of a priori beliefs that are bona fide and which is true, which corresponds to reality. So basically, we've taken 2 lessons, we've taken a couple hours to wrestle through the question of what is truth and how do we know when we know something. And now we know what truth is. Truth is a belief that is sufficiently justified and corresponds to the truth. And if I have that, I have knowledge. If I have that, I can say with confidence, I can say, I know this. I know this is true. Okay? So next week, what I want to do is I want to take a little bit of time to look at a couple challenges to this whole idea of knowing. And there are 2 in particular I want to just touch on briefly next week. One is skepticism, the idea that I doubt that I can know anything. And the other is postmodernism, which isn't strictly skepticism, but it does call into question this whole idea of knowledge, at least some kind of universal knowledge or universally accessible knowledge. And so I want to talk about those a little bit, but the primary thing I want to talk about next week is how do we know Christianity is true? Based on the things we've talked about so far, and thinking about how Scripture assumes and takes for granted certain of these things that we've talked about so far. How can we know that Christianity is true? So that's where we're headed next week. Do we have any questions?